Good morning. Thank you for joining us for another virtual presentation here for Texas Holocaust Remembrance Week. We are honored today to be joined by author Anna Salton Eisen for this presentation this morning. Texas Holocaust Remembrance Week was established in 2019 with the passage of Senate Bill 1828 to educate Texas students about the history and lessons of the Holocaust. During this week, the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio is proud to bring speakers to school campuses, both in person and virtually, to teach students about the Holocaust and inspire in them a responsibility to recognize and uphold human value to prevent future atrocities. At this time, I am proud to introduce our speaker for today, Anna Salton Eisen. Anna is the author of Pillar of Salt, A Daughter's Life in the Shadow of the Holocaust, and with her Holocaust survivor father, George Salton, the co-author of the 23rd Psalm, a Holocaust memoir. Both books are the basis of the forthcoming documentary film, In My Father's Words, which Anna is producing. She was also a founding member and the first president of Congregation Beth Israel in Colleyville, Texas, site of the anti-Semitic hostage crisis in January 2022. Anna has conducted extensive research into the Holocaust and spoken on that topic to school and community groups. She served as a docent for the Dallas Memorial Center for Holocaust Studies, now the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and conducted Holocaust survivor interviews for the USC's Shoah Foundation. She is an ambassador to #EveryNameCounts, a digital initiative of the Allison Archives, the world's most comprehensive archive on the victims and survivors of Nazi persecution. A licensed social worker, Anna formerly practiced as a therapist, specializing in mental health and trauma. Good morning, Anna.
Good morning. Thank you. I want to thank you for having me be a part of Holocaust Remembrance Week in Texas and be a part into your classrooms and into your homes. I'm happy to share the story about my father's experiences in 10 concentration camps between the age of 14 and 17, same age as many of you in your schools now today. While he was a prisoner, him and his fellow prisoners made a promise to each other that if any of them would survive, they would one day go forward and tell the story of what they had been through. So thank you for being a witness and listening to this story. And thank you again for the opportunity to share this with you today.
Yeah, we're going to go ahead and share the video story from Anna, and then at the end we will have time for Q&A during the video. If you come up with a question, you can use the Q&A box to submit that, and then we'll go through questions at the end.
My name is Anna Salton Eisen, and I'm the daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors. Like many Holocaust survivors, my parents never spoke about their past, and it wasn't until I was about 7 or 8 that I began to realize that my family was different. We had no photographs of relatives in the house because, especially on my father's side, we had no relatives. My father never spoke of his childhood or family, and if I asked questions about his youth, he would look very sad and often just change the subject or begin speaking to my mother in a foreign language. About this time, I remember going into our den to look for a deck of playing cards. I reached my hand into a side table drawer and pulled out 2 stiff pieces of paper. They were watercolor paintings, vivid and frightening. I had never seen images like this in a school book or storybook, and I couldn't understand what they were or why they were in my house. The second painting was of a young man kneeling before a pit of bloodied bodies while a soldier pointed a pistol to his head. They were both signed by an L. Zaltzman, a name I didn't know. I put them back in the drawer, knowing I had found something I was not supposed to see, and never spoke of them for nearly 30 years. On my own, I began searching for answers to my questions. I heard my parents mention new words like boxcars, ghettos, and camps when they thought I wasn't listening, and even went into the school library where I found a photo of a liberated camp and wondered if the piles of bodies was the secret and what had happened to my family. It wasn't until I was an adult and moved to Texas where I discovered a Holocaust museum and finally learned about the Holocaust. I became a guide there and then began interviewing Holocaust survivors on tape for a research foundation. It was then that I decided that I did not want a stranger asking my father his story, but that I wanted it to be me. I confronted my father after so many years of silence, and this was his response. I am Adam. Everyone and everything is gone, and it all starts over with me. But all I knew about my grandmother is that she died in a gas chamber, and that wasn't enough. I asked my father to share his story and to consider going back with me to Poland. In a few weeks, my family was on a plane, and we were turning back time to learn what had happened to our people, our family, and to my father. We would go to the major sites in Poland, but also to the small remote towns where he had grown up and been in the ghetto. We visited the famous camp Auschwitz, where we walked along the tracks that led the boxcars into the camp where prisoners were selected to work or go to the gas chambers. I stood in this barracks where some prisoners had made a shoddy ladder and could not imagine how starving and weak prisoners could endure the bitter winters without blankets or proper clothes in these terrible places. We visited empty synagogues where cutouts of Jews in prayer served as a painful reminder of the lives and communities that were swiftly murdered. In the markets, I was stunned to see wooden figurines for sale of these murdered Jews. The features were stereotypical, and along with Jews with prayer books and musical instruments were Jews with bags of money. The old stereotypes and misconceptions were still alive and for sale. We returned to my father's hometown of Tichin. He showed us the old yellow building that had been his elementary school. We walked the neighborhoods and he showed us where his friends, like the Tuchmans, had lived. And we even went into his childhood home where the owner showed us how he was remodeling the rooms into a boarding house. I found myself standing in my grandmother's kitchen, trying to imagine her standing there with me, trying to imagine having a grandmother. Upstairs in the town hall was a closet with remnants from a few gravestones from the Jewish cemetery, which the Nazis had destroyed. There was a box of drawings from the Jewish children that had once lived in the town, and we were astonished to see his friend's name, the Tuchmans. We walked by the creek, deep in the woods, where his family had fled in the dark of the night to hide when the Nazis came to town to arrest and beat up the Jews. Slowly, the story of my father's life was revealed, a life of loss and sadness and suffering. And I learned that my father was the artist who painted those watercolors. My father was Lucien Zaltzman. Here, as a baby, in one of the only photos of his family. My grandfather Herman, a lawyer, my grandmother Anna, my father as a baby, and his older brother, Monik. My father, later in life, began to draw some of the things he had witnessed and experienced. Here, memories of his childhood town before the war. Children playing, Jews walking to the synagogue, and a life that seemed happy and safe. But things changed on September 1st, 1939, when the Germans occupied his town. First, they arrested many of the community leaders, including my grandfather, who was arrested, beaten, and tortured in a Gestapo prison. Jews over the age of 13 were forced to wear armbands with a Star of David, and the Nazis could arrest, humiliate, or even kill Jews for no reason. Here he shows how some were forced to scrub the streets. The Nazis vandalized the synagogue and brought the Torah scrolls, which have written in them the 5 books of the Jewish Bible, and set them on fire. And then, after 2 years of poverty, brutality, and misery, the Jews were ordered to take what belongings they could carry and were relocated to a nearby town where a ghetto had been established. 23,000 Jews would live in a small area without enough room, medical care, or food. It was a place of great danger and uncertainty. Daimler-Benz, who makes Mercedes, had taken over a factory to make airplane engines and needed more workers. Close to 500 Jews, including my father and his brother, were chosen for this work and separated from their families. All of the other Jews were going to be sent on boxcars to farms to live in, but that was a lie. They were sent just a short distance to the Belzec death camp, where they were all gassed on the same day they arrived. Thus began my father's terrible odyssey through 10 Nazi concentration camps over 3 years in Poland, France, and Germany. He would be one of the 465 Daimler-Benz Jews selected for Nazi slave labor. Here, the first camp he was in, called Reichhof. My father was only 14, and after working labor to build the camp, he became a machinist for the Nazis. While here, his brother, who was in a different part of the camp, escaped and fled to the woods to join the resistance fighters. They promised to try and stay alive and meet after the war, and it was this promise and hope that helped my father fight to survive. At one point, the Nazis said no more Jews could be in the factory, and they were sent out on boxcars to another camp, Płaszów, made famous from the movie Schindler's List. This camp was built on the grounds of 2 Jewish cemeteries, and my father drew his memories of how they had to dig up the bodies using shovels and often just their bare hands. From there, they were sent to another camp, Wieliczka, where my father labored in the salt mines. After a few weeks, they were again loaded onto boxcars and sent across the border from Poland into Germany. This next concentration camp was called Flossenburg, and here my father labored in the stone quarry. The work was brutal, and many prisoners were killed when they no longer had the strength to do the heavy labor. In this drawing, as in many others, my father has included his prisoner number. The prisoner on the far left, bent over with a shovel, bears the number 16,019, which was my father's number in this camp. From there, they were sent into France. There was an abandoned tunnel through a mountain where the factory equipment had been brought. Inside the tunnel, someone had painted these words: "Here worked 462 Jews from Poland, as 3 had died." As the Allies approached, the tunnel was destroyed, and again these Jewish prisoners were moved. Loaded onto boxcars, they would be sent back into Germany. The next camp they were sent to was Sachsenhausen. Here my father drew the memory of French resistance prisoners forced to march in a circle with a T that stands for Tod, which means death in German. At the end of the day, one would be selected to be hung, and the next day these prisoners would march in circles again, a cruel and useless torture that went on in this camp. From there, my father and the dwindling prisoners from his group were sent to Wattenstadt. Here the group would be split and sent to 2 different camps. Another prisoner named Joseph Singer pleaded with my father to change uniforms and identities so he could stay with his friends. My father did this, and for a while took on the name of Joseph Singer. The prisoner who changed places with my father did not survive. My father's group went to Braunschweig, while the other prisoners went to a camp called Bremen. They were next sent to a camp called Ravensbrück. This was primarily a women's camp, but had a small sub-camp for men. As the Germans were losing the war, there was no work and little food for the prisoners, who began to die in large numbers. But one more time, they would be moved to the final and 10th camp. Veblen was not even complete when they arrived. Many of the buildings had no windows or doors, and as seen here, the bunks were not completed, and the prisoners just slept in straw on the mud floors. There was no work, barely any food, and the prisoners who died in great numbers were not buried, but just piled up in the yard. On the night of May 1st, they were put into the boxcars again, but after a long night, the trains did not move, and in the morning they were ordered off the trains. The Germans were shooting from the towers, and the prisoners tried to run and hide. Soon it was quiet, and it seemed as though the German guards were gone. It was a wondrous sight. American soldiers, a small group of 7 or 8, had discovered the camp accidentally, and my father and the other prisoners were free. This is a photo taken by an American soldier on that day, May 2nd, 1945. My father is the second prisoner from the right. After liberation, my father spent 2 years in a DP, which stands for Displaced Persons Camp. He was hoping to find his brother and also kept sending letters and messages to his only relative who had been able to go to America before the war. Here is the telegram and papers he received saying he would finally get to go to America. He sailed from Germany on September 22nd, 1947. Here is his photo on the ship and another small drawing he made that day to remember his voyage. In America, he was encouraged to change his name to sound more American, which he did to George Salton. He served in the U.S. Army, met and married my mother, who was also a Holocaust survivor, and then used the GI Bill to continue his education. He went from the 5th grade, the last year he had completed in Poland, right to college, where he earned a bachelor's in physics and master's in engineering, and later had a career in the Pentagon. After our trip to Poland, I helped my father write his memoir that was just published in a 20th anniversary edition with a foreword by Michael Berenbaum, who curated the U.S. Holocaust Museum. Michael Berenbaum wrote, "We must be grateful to George Salton for writing his memoir. His work is painfully honest, and we must remain open to grasp the importance of his work." With the book came amazing discoveries. We wanted to include the photo of my father at liberation that my father had found in a book in the Pentagon War Library. The Germans had called the American parachutists those devil in baggy pants. We sent this book to our publisher, and an editor there discovered that her father had been one of the 7 or 8 soldiers who had liberated the Veblen camp. We flew with CNN for a family meeting and discovered one of the sons had the Nazi flag that his father had cut down when he liberated the camp. In my town of Colleyville, Texas, I heard about another soldier who had liberated the camp. James McGillis, called Maggie, was the most highly decorated veteran of the 82nd Airborne and is a Medal of Honor nominee. I introduced my father to him, and they became friends, and even traveled to the Veblen camp where they had met across the barbed wire for a special ceremony. I last saw Maggie when he turned 101, and he died when he was 103. This past September, I traveled to Arlington National Cemetery to attend his funeral and pay my last respects as my father would have done himself. Father passed away in 2016, and telling his story and honoring the liberators is part of what I have taken on as his daughter. A few years ago, I heard about the Arlson Archives, which houses original Nazi documents, and began a search for my father's records. Looking up his name, knowing his date of birth and town, I made many discoveries. Here, my father's name on a Ravensbrück camp list. His name and number on an original list from the Flossenburg camp. And in beautiful handwriting, prisoner number 33,339, my father, from the concentration camp list from France. I found a post-war card that listed all 10 camps and many of his prisoner numbers. In the first camp, he had a low number of 222 because he was one of only 465 prisoners. I discovered a hand-drawn map of the camps and ghettos where someone had run out of space because these places of terror filled nearly every corner of more than 20 countries. According to the U.S. Holocaust Museum Encyclopedia, there were more than 44,000 sites, including camps, subcamps, and on an inside page of the Flossenburg Report, a few powerful sentences written by an American soldier. If a thought may be interjected, it is hoped that these volumes will prove of help to those who suffered, as well as those who want to prevent a recurrence of such suffering, and that it shall never in the future again be necessary to report such history. I discovered the bread list from the Veblen camp with a blank column on May 2nd, the day there was no bread, but instead freedom, when the American soldiers arrived. So much history to be discovered, so much these documents tell us and how they touch us. And I learned more about what happened on that night of May 1st when the trains did not leave Veblen. There is speculation that the tracks had been blown up by the Americans or the locomotive never arrived. What we do know is that those prisoners loaded on the boxcar were headed to Lübeck Bay. There, the prisoners from the Neuengamme and the subcamps, including Veblen, were loaded onto two ships that were mistakenly fired upon by the British aircraft and sunk, causing the death of more than 6,000 prisoners on May 3rd. My father would have been among them. My mother came to live with me a few years ago, and in my parents' home we found an envelope with these special items. My father's post-war pass as a former concentration camp prisoner, a small calendar and diary, and a collection of photographs of his friends from the DP camps. Turning them over, I recognized the names of his friends from his town, from the ghettos and 10 camps. They were now more than names, they were real people. I went back to searching the archives to try and find some of them and made incredible discoveries. Here, a list of the 465 Häftlinge, prisoners, Jews from Reichshof, on the way to Colmar in France near the tunnel. My father's name, third from the bottom. I went back to the Ravensbrück list and found their names, the hometowns and dates of birth of his friends. They all had Flossenburg possession cards, all blank because they had no possessions, but they had their information and signature, and then I matched them to the post-war cards indicating where they might be going. I started tracking them on Ancestry, Google, Facebook, and every possible way. I set out to find 7 of the friends my father had spoken of, written about in his book. Friends who had been with him in the ghetto, in the 10 camps, and he had been liberated with. Friends who had encouraged him, shared their bread, and helped keep my father alive. And I found them all. None knew the details of their fathers, who had all remained silent, just as my father had. We had a reunion in person and over Zoom from Sweden, Israel, New York, Texas, and New Jersey. Fathers had shared a bond of survival, never dreaming, I'm sure, that one day their children would find each other, become friends, and share a bond of remembrance. I also found out what happened to my father's brother, who never came to America or made contact with a relative in New York. I found a record stating that Monik, son of Herman, a student from Titchen, was alive in 1946. But I also found a man who said that his brothers were with my uncle in the woods, fighting in the resistance, and that after the war they had gone to find a Jewish baby girl who had been left with a Polish family. They did not want to give the baby up, and Monik was shot and killed by someone in that house through an open window. I also found that baby girl they went to reclaim, who took my uncle's last name as her own. A few words about my mother, who passed away at 100 years old. Her family fled Poland during the war and crossed into Russia. Unwilling to become Russian citizens, they were arrested and sent to Siberia. After the war, she returned to Poland and joined the Brigade, which means escape. This organization helped Holocaust survivors cross the mountains to flee Europe and collected the orphan children as seen in the bottom left photo. My mother is the woman in the top photo and also on the bottom left wearing the cape. 85% of all Jewish children in Europe were killed during the Holocaust, and it was their mission to find the remaining children that the parents had meant to reclaim after the war and bring them to Israel. And so years after helping my father write his memoir, I wrote Pillar of Salt, which tells of my father's return to Poland and how the stories are passed down through the generations. Here is a favorite photo, my father and son walking through the Majdanek concentration camp, walking in step and having the conversation that my father could not have with me until my adulthood. And now my son is helping to tell the story and produce a documentary film based on both books and my father's experiences. In January of 2022, my rabbi and friends were taken hostage at Congregation Beth Israel in Colleyville, Texas, at the synagogue that I helped start. I remember having to tell my mother what was going on. After the Holocaust, how could this terrible hatred and anti-Semitism rise up again? Will we never learn? I attended the Senate hearing of Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, U.S. envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. Why is this position even needed? How can we fight or eradicate hate, the hate that only divides us and can easily lead to violence? These are the questions for all of us. This is why we need to learn from the past. Who was my father? He was Lucian Zaltzman. I look at his photo and I look at the painting and believe that he was trying to tell his story when it was unspeakable. I see in the painting a young man in the background with a yellow star and the number 222, the same number and a star in his notebook from 1946. Under my father's name, I see he has written the name of Joseph Singer. There are important things one must not, or maybe cannot, ever forget. And my grandmother, she was more than someone who died in the gas chamber. From my father's stories and her letters, sent from Poland with the heavy hand of a Nazi censor, I learned that she was a strong woman who sold and traded everything she had to get food for her family. I learned that she was brave and pleaded with every lawyer and judge my grandfather had worked with until she found some Christians who were willing to help get my grandfather released from the Gestapo prison. And I learned that she was the most loving mother who convinced my father to stay behind in the ghetto, for he didn't want to be left behind, but it might have been the only chance for him to survive. And he did. And so I'm honored to carry her name and her memory. Thank you for letting me share my story.
Thank you, Anna. So at this time, if anybody has any questions, you can, again, put it into the Q&A box there. And if not, I would like to know if you can tell us a little bit more about your mother's experiences and the organization that she worked for. Maybe people in our audience are not familiar with the process of helping people to escape after the Holocaust.
Sure. Well, the organization was called the Bricha, which means escape. And so after the war, many of the Holocaust survivors found themselves living in countries which were not their countries of origin. And they did not have the means and maybe were fearful to go back. And so many of them were put into places to live temporarily. My mother was in such a place in Poland, in a town called Szczecin, where there was a building like a big warehouse that they turned into kind of a shelter for Holocaust survivors who had nowhere to go. And for a while, she worked there volunteering in the kitchen to make meals. And then at one point, she was approached to become an operative, a helper, to go and look for Holocaust survivor children and try and bring them to this place to see if they could find any living family members, and also to help the survivors cross the borders from Czechoslovakia, Italy, the Alps, that they were trying to leave Europe and go to Israel. So she joined this organization and she would go and look for children. Some had been graciously, kept safe in convents or in homes. And then once in this collective place, they would have to feed them. And then they would travel during the day, sometimes at night, and try and cross the borders to get to ships to take them across the sea to Israel.
Wow. We do have a question from the chat. They wanted to know if you have any more information on the baby girl that your uncle was going to get. How did they know about the baby? Did they know her parents? Have you discovered the connection between them?
Yes, that's a great question. So there were three brothers. The one I met was the youngest, and he was hidden in a farm and far away. The two other brothers were in the resistance with my uncle, and the parents and one sister were hidden together in a barn. And so it was the sister that had been pregnant and had this baby. So they knew they couldn't keep it in the barn. They had no food, they had no supplies, and they were fearful if the baby cried, they would get discovered. So they left it at the doorstep of several different days. And finally, one day, a woman came out and they watched her take the baby in the house. And they had left a note saying, please, if you take care of this baby, we will come back, we will pay you. And so after the war, the two older brothers and my uncle went to this house. And that's when my uncle was shot. After the war, this baby ended up in many, many orphanages. And then many years later, one of the brothers went to search for her. The parents and the sister, the mother of the baby, were all turned in by someone in town, and they were all killed. And so I met her, found her. I was able to connect her with my father, and she lives in Chicago, and she actually has taken the name of my uncle, our family name, and now kind of claims him as her own father, because she didn't know who her father was.
Mm-hmm.
So a very touching connection.
Have you, in any of your research, learned any more about your uncle's activities in the resistance?
I mean, not specifically to his name, but yes, I've learned about what was happening, in the woods. It was Polish resistance fighters joined with the Jewish resistance fighters, and they would try and blow up rail lines or, the roads, so the trucks couldn't come in with supplies. And they were in the woods for many, many years with very terrible conditions, just trying to do what they could to slow down the German army.
Okay. And in the process of writing your father's memoirs, did he kind of discuss with you why he didn't want to share these experiences with you as you were growing up?
Yes, I mean, we spoke about it. And then later, in the afterwards of his book that I co-wrote, the 23rd Psalm, we have excerpts of some of his speeches and talks and reflections. And he says that, he tried to live his life the way his parents would have wanted, as if it didn't happen or touch him or taint him. He was encouraged in America to move forward, which I think we do with a lot of people, to try and get them to move beyond their hardships and trauma. And I think he was worried about how it would affect his children. That, yes, I did indeed have nightmares and I was frightened, but that's when it was all a secret. Once I had him to talk about it with and process it and travel with him, then I was able to incorporate this narrative into my family history and really be proud of him for how he had cared for others, the strength to survive, and the kind of ethical, moral, and kind person that he had become.
And how do you think the experience of finally sharing his story and giving speeches and writing this book impacted your father? Because I know it's later in his life that he starts to share. How do you think that impacted him, and how has this whole experience kind of impacted your family?
Well, I think at the beginning, he thought maybe people wouldn't want to know, or he shouldn't talk about it. But right away, people, and even many American soldiers or families of liberators, because my father was so grateful for his liberation and to be an American, would come up and thank him and say, thank you for telling your story, for sharing, what you've been through, how you endured, your wisdom. And I think it inspired other people, as well as touched them emotionally, to be more compassionate and stand out and speak out against hate. And I think it helped to move from not just being a victim of the Holocaust, but a real survivor, the way we might meet other survivors of illness and just admire their courage and wish them, long life and good health. And I think it gave him and gave me a purpose that I could take this terrible time, the worst of humanity, and try and bring the message that we must try to live our lives with the goal of bringing the best of humanity, to fight hate, to be caring and compassionate, to preserve and protect history, and fight Holocaust denial and distortion.
And I think that segues into my next question. So we are in the middle of Texas Holocaust Remembrance Week, a week set up for students to learn about the history of the Holocaust. How does learning about this event, how does learning about the Holocaust impact future generations? Why is it important that we continue to teach this to students today?
Well, I think, we can learn from history. If not, our history can become our destiny. So I think when we see what led to the rise of Hitler and Nazism, the prejudice, the Nuremberg laws, the way of treating people as less than human, denial of rights, the murder of innocent families and children, then hopefully it creates in us the need to live and create a better and more just society. I think when we look back at also the liberators in the other countries and the politics and how all these nations united to try and fight Hitler. I mean, the Nazis occupied more than 20 countries. So it is a great part of history of all these countries, France, Italy, Norway, and each of them has unique stories. And I think, as it's suggested, that we look at individual lives and how they were affected, which we tried to do in the books and we will in the film. We try and touch people in a way that it opens up their heart and their thinking and creates in them, this goal of remembering, learning, and indeed protecting the truth, the accurate truth of what happened.
So you mentioned the film. Can you tell us a little bit more about the forthcoming documentary, or where people can get more information about it?
Sure. Well, if you go to the website, Eisen.com, there is a teaser for the film. But we have a great creative team, filmmakers, artists, music, and we are doing a compilation of my father's testimonies, family comments, documents, his artwork, our original footage from returning to Poland, as well as we're collaborating with the U.S. Holocaust Museum and the Arlington Nazi Archives. And we are doing a lot of creative things with original footage to try and create a moving and inspirational new way to look at and engage viewers with this Holocaust story. So we expect this summer to be bringing it out into hopefully film festivals, and stay tuned because we think it's really going to be a wonderful thing for this and future generations.
Wonderful. And so we have time for one last question. With Holocaust Remembrance Week this year, we are encouraging students to focus on the idea of the upstander, of being an upstander, not a bystander. What can students do to honor the victims and survivors of the Holocaust?
Well, I would say, learn something, challenge yourself, read the memoir, another book, watch a documentary, and just, if you hear something, say something. And there's a lot of different populations that were affected by the Holocaust. And I think, tying it into how we need to remember lives and speak out, because I really believe that bullies or those who wish harm, if they are not confronted, they are empowered because they get the message they will get away with this. So I think to learn as much as we can, to speak out, to help others, and just to become more educated. And that will make us a greater asset to all of society and humanity.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna, for being here with us this morning. Thank you for everyone who joined us either in the webinar or watching on the live stream. We appreciate you all being here and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.